Hey guys, welcome back to Nyx Reads, where we talk about books, usually about once a week. Thank you so much for watching. Please feel free to subscribe if you love any kind of bookish content, and give this video a thumbs up, please, if you love monthly wrap-ups, so I know what you guys like to watch. I read 6 books in August, which I'm very happy with. While I didn't have a 5-star read in August, I have 2 books that came very close with 4.5 stars. As of usual lately, I'm gonna go through the books from worst rating to best rating. And don't forget to stay until the end of the video to find out how much money I saved by using my library card, and also to see me, or actually in this case my boyfriend, pick out a new book from my TBR jar. So my least successful book for August with 3 stars, which is still a good rating, is The Christmas Swap by Talia. This was in my anticipated releases video. It's coming out on October 10th, so just in time for your cozy Christmas reading list. Our main character is Margot Murray, who just recently got out of a not so great relationship, and she agrees to help out a friend, Ben, to pretend that she is his girlfriend for the holidays because he's going home to a manor in the English countryside with his family, and he's kind of sick of being pitied for always being single, so she kindly agrees to play along. The twist in the story, and this is not a spoiler, is that instead of Margot eventually falling for Ben, she falls for Ben's sister, Ellie. I gave this 3 stars because it was a cute read, but it was really just not that memorable for me. I think I'm gonna forget about this book in a few months from now, but sometimes during the Christmas period, you really want to pick up that kind of book. So if that synopsis sounded good to you, then don't let my critique point stop you from adding this to your TBR. I have 3 points that I didn't particularly like about this book. The first one is that it was 100% Insta attraction, very specific attraction. It felt very rushed. There was no part in this book where you kind of feel the characters being curious about each other and having that tingling in their stomach. It was very fast. Then again, it is a very short book, so I guess the author wanted to get straight to the point. And there's also a misunderstanding element in the story, which to me came across as a bit silly because the reasoning for the character misunderstanding something didn't have reasonable footing. For me, it resulted in that character coming across as very immature. And lastly, the story is told from 2 points of views, alternating. I thought that the voices were very similar to each other. I would often get confused from whose perspective I was reading from, and then I would have to jump back to the beginning of the chapter to see whose point of view it was, because there was just not a big distinction. I believe this is the first novel by the author, and in a way it just really does show the signs of a debut romance novel. What I did like about this book is definitely the setting. As I said, it is in the English countryside, in a manor. There's dogs, there's cozy fires, and I thought Margot processing her past relationship was honestly the best written part out of everything, and that was really fleshed out. Also, the sapphic romance is a clean romance, I think that's what you call it, because it doesn't really have any sexual or too intimate content. So if this is something that you're looking for, a hallmarky Christmas rom-com, then don't be afraid to put it on your TBR. Next up, with 3.5 out of 5 stars, is Lessons in Chemistry by Garmus. The video that I published prior to this one is actually a full review just about this book, so I'm not going to dwell on this. You can watch that if you're interested to hear more of my thoughts. All in all, I thought this was compulsively readable. I flew through this book within a few days. I couldn't put it down. There was just something about the writing that kept me so engaged. I like how the dialogues were written that I just needed to carry on with the story. The story takes place in California in the 60s, where we follow scientist Elizabeth Stott throughout the key points of her life and why she's a scientist that ended up being the host of her own cooking show. And albeit how fun the cover looks like, this book has very dark moments. There's trigger warnings in here for sexual harassment. In short, while I flew through this book, the reason why I only gave it 3.5 stars is because the characters needed a bit more nuance. They needed a bit more work because they felt, all of them felt fairly stereotypical. Also, there were side storylines in there that I think diverted from the main part of the plot. All in all, a very successful debut, and I really do hope that this author writes another book with maybe some improvements in the characters, I would 100% pick it up. I'm also linking the video in the description box in case you want to hear more details. Next up, with 4 stars, I have Emil and the Detectives by Erich Kaestner. This is a book that was published in 1929 by German author Erich Kaestner, and this was also part of my Classics Challenge. As you can probably guess by the cover design, this is a children's book. So there's some illustrations in my copy, and it obviously read very fast. I read it, I think, within 2 days. You could probably finish this within 1 day. This book is about 12-year-old boy Emil, who for the first time ever takes a train on his own to visit the big city of Berlin to visit his grandma. But while he's on the train, he gets robbed of all his money, and from there on, a chase ensues in Berlin with a bunch of other boys his age that he meets that help him get his money back. This book surpassed my expectations because this was written by an author in the 1920s with themes and values that could be outdated at this point. But that was not the case at all. Happy to say that. Emil is raised by a single mom, and there's such a huge emphasis in this book about being humble and respecting and appreciating the hard work that his mom does for him and the family. Also, courage is a big theme in this book, having a sense of responsibility and taking action, helping other people. The main aspect or value, I should say, that the author is trying to bring across in this book that surprised me the most in a positive way. He's defining manhood, so what these boys are trying to grow into, as not just being bold, which is what I suspected is going to happen, but being compassionate, taking on a very supportive role, and even staying back and recognizing that maybe that is where you can help the most. I loved that aspect about this book. So while obviously the language and the cars and trains that you have in this book are outdated, the lessons are not. So I think this is a good recommendation for kids, adults, and also adults reading books to kids. I enjoyed the portrayal of Berlin. Believe it or not, I still haven't visited the capital. I know, I'm due. An additional thing that surprised me in this book is the Anglicism. I didn't realize that even back in the 20s, there were English words that already made their way into the German language. Upon finishing this book, I went ahead and read a bit more about the author. While I knew the name, I knew very little about the author's background. One of the things that I found was that when the Nazis burned books, the students in Berlin burned books on I think it was the 10th of May, 1933, at the start of World War II, they actually also burned books from this author. Not this one in particular. This wasn't banned until a bit later. They burned his work Fabian and also some of his poems. They were describing this author's works as obscene and unmoral, and the reasoning for that is mainly because he was using a lot of anti-militaristic themes in his book. He wrote socio-critical essays and poems. So not only did they burn his books that day, but Erich Kaestner himself was there. He was present. He saw the Nazis burn his works, and I don't think these are direct quotes, but he was saying that it was like watching his own funeral. I wanted to share that piece of information with you, the piece of history, just in case you do pick this book up, so you know that this used to be a banned book. Not anymore, thank God. Next, also with 4 stars, I have the nonfiction book Cooked by Michael Pollan. This author is very well known for his food writing. This book was incredibly interesting. I listened to it as an audiobook, which made me feel like I was listening to a giant podcast, which was great. That's why the book is divided into 4 main parts, and every main part for each element has subsections. And for each of these elements, the author has a bit of history in there. So how did humanity come across working this element into their food and their nutrition? There's also always anthropological parts in these chapters, which were some of my favorite ones. I love any kind of anthropological angle in nonfiction writing. Then there's a section of Michael Pollan reaching out to a very big name within the culinary world to teach him techniques that have to do with that element. So that can be, for example, a chef, a grill master, nuns who make cheeses, as well as then going into trying all of these cooking techniques at home, which is obviously interesting for the reader or the listener to see how can I apply any of this at home in my own kitchen. I enjoyed this so much, especially also the parts where he talks to the experts within this field, because one of them is Sami Nosrat, who I know from Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. There's also very interesting thoughts in this book about production versus consumption. So how much of what we eat do we make at home versus what do we buy pre-made? The reason why I couldn't give this quite 5 stars is because I had 2 clear favorite chapters. It was the first 2, so Fire and Water. The last chapter, Earth, was not as strong, I think, and also I couldn't quite get the distinction between Earth and Air. So that's where he lost me a little bit. But other than that, it was such a great nonfiction. And if you're starting to put together your list for Nonfiction November, then definitely consider adding this to your TBR if you have some kind of culinary interest. Such a great read. Next, with 4.5 stars, so almost a perfect book, is Dracula by Bram Stoker. If you watch my channel, you know that I enjoy especially literary horror and I enjoy gothic stories, so you can imagine that this classic was just right up my alley. I haven't read a lot of classics in my life, but I would say that this is, at the moment, probably top 3. Don't ask me what the other top 2 are, this was a guess. I don't think I need to tell you what the story is about, but I didn't know going into the story that this is going to be in the epistolary format. I forgot to look this up, but is this maybe one of the first mixed media type of books? Because not only does this consist of letters, but there's also articles in here that we're taking out of papers. This was so good. I've never taken an English literature class in my life, so I just have a list here of themes that stood out to me in this book, but I don't really have an explanation or a deep dive on why or what exactly they mean. So if you have taken an English lit class, then please feel free to write me an essay in the comment section. A very repetitive thing that stuck out to me was how the male characters in this book especially had no inhibitions, or they would always hint at, well, you should technically repress your feelings, but they would just let their feelings and their tears and their emotions loose. So often would they have these speech outbreaks or would be crying and talking about how they're feeling about the situation, about their suffering, fears. It was so interesting to read. I thought that friendship also took an interesting center role in this book, but also the worship of the women in this book, especially Mina and Lucy. They were being put on these ridiculous pedestals of purity. That was something that was very odd at times. Also fascinating is the element of homoerotica in this book. For me personally, this element of blood sharing that these men have, I'm not going to go into much details because I don't want to spoil you, also was a very intriguing one. In general, there was so much sexuality hidden in plain sight within this book that now that I've read this book, before this I did watch the movie with Winona Ryder and Gary Oldman as Dracula. Now looking back, I understand why that movie took on this very erotic angle to the story. I see what inspired it. Another movie that I grew up with and watched so many times because we happened to have it as DVD is Van Helsing with Hugh Jackman. This was the first time I saw or I read about Van Helsing on paper. So obviously this Van Helsing in this book is very, very different from the one that we see in that particular movie from the early 2000s. The 0.5 that I took off my rating was mostly because of all of the repetition in here, because a lot of the times the experiments that Van Helsing would do with the doctors surrounding anybody who was affected by Dracula, they kept doing the same thing over and over again. But I understand why, because it was to prove that there was something wrong, that there was something supernatural in the makings. Nevertheless, I enjoyed this classic so much. This was an entertaining and over-the-top classic all around. Lastly, with 4.5 stars and my favorite read of August is One of the Good Guys by Araminta. I read this as an ARC from NetGalley as well. I loved this. I could not shut up about this book while I was reading it. So Cole just recently separated from his wife after multiple failed attempts at IVF, and now he's moved to the countryside in order to, you know, move on with his life. Here in the countryside by the sea, he meets artist Leonora, who lives in a cottage on her own, and they start to date. While all of this is happening, we have a group of women that are organizing this walk to raise awareness for violence against women, and two of them that are very outspoken on social media suddenly are missing. Somehow Leonora and Cole are involved in the investigation. I want to give you the reasons why I love this so much, but at the same time I don't want to go into many details, because a part of the beauty of this book is that you do not really see where this book is gonna go. I do think you should know going into this book that this is one political statement. There's no working around that. If you're going into this book expecting literary fiction that goes into some subtleties of a feminist movement, of violence against women, of misogyny, I think you're gonna be hit very, very hard in the face with what this book really is, and I think that might turn you off. So right from the start, I'm gonna tell you that this book has a very, very clear intention, and I think the author did a great job in executing this story. It is just, it chilled me to the bones. There's lengths that some of the characters go to in this book that you as the reader might or might not agree with. I think that that can be a point where the opinions can split, but at no point is anything that happens in this book or being said in this book too much, superfluous, because all of this happens in real life. This book really impressed me. It does go the distance. So if you pick this up, just know that it won't circle around the topic, right? It'll hit it right on the head. I feel like we got really dark here for a second, so if you're still watching, why don't you leave a wine or a flower emoji? All right, so those are the 6 books that I read in August, and the total amount that I saved by using my library card pre-tax is $66.95. It's a bit later in the day now and my boyfriend's home from work, so it's time now for him to pull out a new book from my TBR jar. Okay, are you ready? Okay, open it and you can read it to me.
The Swan Book.
Oh, okay. All right, so this is one that I didn't plan on reading anytime soon, so I think it's good that you pull it out. So it's this book here. I got this from, do you remember when we went to the big book sale where you buy books by the kilo?
Yes.
That's where I got this from. If I remember correctly, this is from an Australian author. It sounded quite dark. It's, I think, post-apocalyptic. No, it's a dystopian. I've never heard anything about this book. I just picked it up on a whim. So going into this with no expectations, let's see if I like it. If you want to know what I think about this book, then definitely subscribe to this channel to see this book featured in one of my future wrap-ups. Thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy monthly reading wrap-ups, and I'll see you guys next time.